This video was made possible thanks to my generous Patreon supporters. If you too would like to support the channel, including my upcoming UK series, stay tuned to the end to learn more. Perhaps no US city has as iconic a brand as New Orleans. To the average American, New Orleans means jazz, old-timey narrow streets with beautiful buildings, moss hanging from the trees, riverboats, Mardi Gras, ornate mansions, gumbo, booze, and overall just taking it easy and having a good time. Tourism and hospitality are some of New Orleans' biggest industries, worth over $9 billion, and the city pours a lot of time and energy into its brand to keep this industry going, especially in the 18 years since Hurricane Katrina. One way it has done this is through transit. Besides a heritage streetcar dating back to 1835, New Orleans hosts a network of modern streetcar lines built between 1988 and 2016, which connect tourist destinations with vintage replica equipment. Visitors love it. There's even a whole page on the city's official tourism website listing places you can eat, drink, and explore along each streetcar line. But given how integral streetcars are to New Orleans transit, how well do they serve local residents? And what is the rest of the city's transit like? The only way to find out is to go for a ride. New Orleans is built along both sides of the Mississippi River, right near its mouth. West of downtown, we find St. Charles Avenue, which winds its way up through the city's Garden District, passing Audubon Park. Uptown and Carrollton lie to the north. Union Passenger Terminal serves as the city's Amtrak and Greyhound station, with trains to Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York, as well as future service to Mobile, Alabama. Yes, Walter, it's going to open, and when it does, you owe me a ticket. The convention center sits along the waterfront, and the wide Canal Street leads from there to the city's famous cemeteries, as well as City Park and the Museum of Art. To the east, we find the touristy French Quarter, home to Bourbon Street, Jackson Square, Frenchmen Street, and the French Market District, among other attractions. Finally, the elevated Pontchartrain Causeway bisects the city. Streetcars in New Orleans are run by the city's Regional Transit Authority, or RTA, which, despite having one of the most generic transit names, more than makes up for it with a fabulous logo, featuring the Mardi Gras colors of green for faith, gold for power, and purple for justice. The number 12 streetcar runs from Uptown to Canal Street, mostly along St. Charles Avenue. This line has more or less remained consistent in the recent past, but the remainder of the streetcar system is constantly in a state of flux, with services being rerouted and branches closed periodically. And I actually had to redo this map after it turned out I was using an old source from just a few years ago. Like seriously, here's the map from 2013, here it is in 2017, and here it is now. Currently, the 49 connects Union Terminal with the French Market District along the riverfront, with lines to the Convention Center and Elysian Fields Avenue currently out of service, the latter of which was closed after only 2 years of service by the Hard Rock Hotel collapse of 2019. The 47 connects Canal Street and the city's cemeteries, while the 48 parallels it until Carrollton Avenue, where it branches off to the Museum of Art. And I think that's everything until the system inevitably changes again. Just left my hostel after getting a good night's sleep, and our first destination is right over here. Here. There we go. I was lucky to get a hostel right next to the number 12 streetcar, which is more commonly known as the St. Charles Line. It's been open since 1835, making it the oldest operating streetcar not just in the United States, but in the world. Cars are painted in an iconic dark green with red doors, and modern advertisements and logos are painted and plastered on the sides, feeling out of place on these historic vehicles. New Orleans never embraced the PCC streetcar, so these cars are from the previous generation, built between 1923 and 1924 by the Pearlie A. Thomas Car Company, which is now school bus manufacturer Thomas Built Buses. And these cars are so much fun to ride. Just listen to the wonderful noises they make as we roll down St. Charles Avenue. The St. Charles Line began as a horse-drawn system, and it now runs a total of 6 miles. It utilizes Pennsylvania trolley gauge, similar to Philadelphia's trolleys and Pittsburgh's light rail, and it travels most of its distance in a dedicated greenway. Fun fact, the Pearlie Thomas cars aren't actually the oldest vehicles on the line. That title falls to 2-axle maintenance car number 29, which dates back to 1896. This may be the oldest piece of equipment used for maintenance of way service in the United States today. And as we'll see throughout this video, streetcars are directly tied to the history of New Orleans. Not all of it is good history. For example, the city's transit was racially segregated from 1835 to 1867, integrated until 1902, and then segregated again until 1958. Streetcars also allowed white residents to live further from downtown, creating racially divided neighborhoods that opened the doors to legalized segregation. In 1929, workers on this line and others staged a strike, and supportive locals brought them sandwiches made with French bread. This is possibly the origin of the famous New Orleans po' boy sandwich, after the poor boys from the streetcar companies protesting for higher wages. The Garden District was spared the worst of Hurricane Katrina, and the historic Pearly Thomas streetcars were kept safe in their car barn during the storm. However, enough downed trees had fallen onto the St. Charles line that it took 3 years for the full line to be brought back into service. On the return trip, it's hard to see it from the streetcar, but we pass incredibly close to the Mississippi River and its natural levee, turning back onto St. Charles Avenue. I hop off a few blocks later to visit Audubon Park and enjoy some southern wildlife. Audubon Park is named after artist and naturalist John James Audubon, who, in addition to advancing both of his fields, was a slave owner. The land this park was built on was also a slave plantation and a base for the Confederate Army. Like I said, not all the history here is good history. At least this park is a good place to relax and observe plants, birds, and reptiles, and slowly melt in the June humidity. Now we're back on the streetcar heading towards downtown. The St. Charles Line was recognized as a National Historic Landmark in 2014, the second street railway to receive this designation, after San Francisco's cable cars. While the historic Pearly Thomas cars are loved by almost everyone, they have one major flaw: they're not wheelchair accessible. To solve this, RTA built a small set of replica cars for this route, with wheelchair lifts, and made a few stations along the route wheelchair accessible. Back at my hostel, there's a pileup of streetcars, so we're asked to move to a car in front of us. This takes us under the Pontchartrain Causeway and around what is now Harmony Circle. Up until recently, this was called Lee Circle, after the statue of Robert E. Lee that was built here in 1884. Since we as a country have been less enthusiastic about celebrating traitors of late, the city removed the statue in 2017, and while it's due to be replaced by a water feature, I would love to see it instead replaced by a statue of New Orleans native and civil rights activist Homer Plessy. Mr. Plessy was a biracial man who, one day in 1892, deliberately sat in a whites-only section of a train as an act of civil disobedience, leading to the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case, which unfortunately upheld racial segregation in 1896. I came to New Orleans on a very integrated Amtrak Crescent, and I think it would be cool to commemorate a person who fought for that. We turn and head down Carondelet Street. The median has ended now, and we're running in the street itself. Finally, we reach Canal Street, which at one point was the widest street in the world. Historically, it divided the original French colonial city from newer development by American settlers, and it was named after a planned canal that would have run along this route, although this never came to fruition. Its median was known as the neutral ground, as it marked the divide between francophones and anglophones. Because of this, today New Orleans residents use the term neutral ground to mean median no matter which city street you're talking about. For that matter, New Orleans residents kinda have their own terms for everything. People here say make groceries instead of get groceries, flying horses instead of merry-go-round, and cold drink instead of soda or pop. And I thought Pittsburgh had an unusual amount of local vernacular. Here at the intersection of Carondelet and Canal Streets, a few interesting things happen. Carondelet crosses Canal and becomes Bourbon Street, the most famous tourist street in the city, or infamous depending on who you ask, filled with bars, restaurants, and gift shops. The St. Charles Line loops onto Canal Street's neutral ground and dips back down St. Charles Avenue on its own dedicated track. And it's here that we're introduced to the rest of the city's streetcars. Canal Street's neutral ground ended up being perfect for transit, and for many years it was a streetcar thoroughfare. The original streetcars were replaced by buses in 1964, but in 2004, the Canal Street line was reopened to the public, sporting modern streetcars built in the style of the older ones, but with added wheelchair lifts and air conditioning. I'd like to ride one of these, but there's just one problem. None are showing up, and there's no obvious reason why. Eventually, I decide to hop on one of the RTA buses perusing the neutral ground, in the hopes of at least seeing more of the line, and soon we're off, passing several other confused tourists. The bus catches up to a streetcar, which seems to be operating short turns along the northern bit of Canal Street, and I get on board. It takes almost half an hour to make the 2.6-mile journey from there to the cemeteries, at an average speed of about 6 miles per hour. In that time, there are 2 different rain showers, with periods of sunshine in between, because New Orleans weather can't make up its mind in the summer. At least I'm in a modern-built car with air conditioning and closed windows, which makes it a bit more bearable. Unfortunately, just a year after the Canal Street line's 2004 opening, the new streetcars, which were stored outside, were severely damaged by the floods following Hurricane Katrina. The older Pearly Thomas cars had to take over the route, until the new cars were repaired. We reach the cemeteries, which have their own dedicated cemeteries transit center. Here, people aren't buried underground. The water table is simply too high. Instead, they're placed in stone boxes that sit above the ground. Fun fact about these cars, they were originally intended to be rebuilt PCCs, and at one point 6 SEPTA PCCs were imported to the city for parts, one of which was taken for a joyride on the St. Charles line in 1995 by a maintenance crew. All but one were eventually scrapped. We return to the endpoint for trolleys and board a city bus, which makes a deviation towards Union Terminal. The 49 streetcar isn't running today, but we parallel its route. And it's here that I really begin to notice something funny about the RTA's streetcar system. Outside of old-timey rolling stock, they seem to be trying for a modern look and feel, with shelters, maps, and schedules that feel like something from a modern streetcar or light rail system. The bus returns us to Canal Street, and takes us all the way down to the Mississippi River, where the driver informs me that the riverfront streetcar is out of commission for the day. So I guess it's time for a treat.
Let's get some, how are they pronounced? Beignets?
New Orleans beignets are inspired by similar desserts from France, but they're made with leavened dough instead of the original French pastry material. Beignets are also the Louisiana state donut. There's only one other state with a state donut, and I know some of you in the comments are already typing what it is, so I'll let you have that fun.
So I just waited half an hour for these, so these better be good. There is an obscene amount of powdered sugar pretty much everywhere. So was that worth waiting 35 minutes for? Kinda on the fence.
During the rest of my time in New Orleans, I walked around the French Quarter, tried some more local food, visited Jackson Square, and listened to some great live jazz music. I really enjoyed my time in the city, but there was a problem. The transit wasn't very useful. Frequencies on bus routes serving the areas I wanted to visit weren't great. Buses didn't show up when Google said they would, and a decent portion of the streetcar system was closed without great signage indicating this. Even with 24-hour streetcar service on the lines that were open, a very unusual feature for a heritage system, I didn't feel like I could quickly or reliably get around the city on transit, and I ended up Ubering a lot. Fundamentally, I felt like the RTA was running streetcars primarily for people like me. People who wanted a joyride akin to the Strasburg Railroad, and were okay with long waits and single-digit speeds, rather than people who genuinely needed to get places. I know New Orleans residents sometimes use the streetcar system for commuting, and from its modern station stop and wayfinding infrastructure, it seems like the RTA wants people to treat the streetcar as a serious mode of transit, almost like a quaint light rail. But then you get cars that look like this, which run at 8-minute headways at best, move at an average speed of 6 miles per hour, stop frequently, and for the most part don't have signal priority. And that kind of destroys any image of modernity and practicality. These are tourist lines more than they are legitimate transit. That's not to say building tourist trains is bad, but if that appears to be the majority of your city's transit focus, there start to be problems. New Orleans spent the years following Katrina investing primarily in streetcars, while its once robust bus network was left to suffer. Residents had to deal with infrequent routes, poor coverage, and frequent delays. Quite a few buses were destroyed in the floods, and it took months after the hurricane to get any routes running again. When I shot this video in 2021, 4% of city residents took transit to work, as compared to 14% in 2000. All this was a massive disservice to the hard-working people of New Orleans, including those who work in the service industry, since touristy areas are expensive to live in and workers need to commute. And lower-income residents, who are disproportionately people of color, need equitable transit more than anyone. Thankfully, things are looking up. In September 2022, a massive redesign of the bus network took place to better serve the city, and now RTA is planning a 15-mile bus rapid transit system to improve on this, running between the city's east and west banks, and connecting neighborhoods with downtown. 22,000 people will live within a quarter mile of the new system, 3/4 of whom are people of color, and 30% of whom live below the poverty line. But if New Orleans is so enthusiastic about its streetcar system, and continuing to build more lines, it might be worth tapping into the system's greater potential as well, in order to better serve tourists and locals alike. Streetcars go where people want to go, and there's great land use around the lines and stations. And fundamentally, rail, when done properly, can provide a speed and capacity advantage over even the best buses. New Orleans streetcars could hypothetically be turned into a reliable, modern light rail system with select heritage operations. It's been done before, in a city called Blackpool. Blackpool sits on the west coast of England, and it boasts one of Britain's oldest remaining tramways. Up until very recently, All service was done using old heritage cars, which traveled up and down an 11-mile line, facing the demands of a full-time transit system with aging equipment. In the 2010s, the tracks were overhauled, and new modern Bombardier Flexity trams were purchased to take over the day-to-day operation. The heritage cars didn't go anywhere. They still run on weekends and holidays, and during the summer tourism season. But now, between its old and new fleets, Blackpool can stay firmly rooted in the past for tourists, while also moving decisively into the future for its own people. One could hypothetically see New Orleans doing the same thing, perhaps converting the canal, rampart, and riverfront lines into a faster and more frequent light rail, with fewer stops, retaining the St. Charles line as a heritage route, and occasionally running old-timey cars on the whole system, perhaps on weekends and around Mardi Gras or the city's jazz festival. You could still call it the Streetcar if you wanted to maintain the branding. San Diego's done something similar with their trolley. In the longer term, the city's BRT could become light rail as well, with through service between, say, the East Bank and cemeteries, or Union Station at the West Bank. If anyone wants to crayon a map of what this could look like, please send it to me on email or Discord. And if anyone's concerned, I don't think modern streetcars or light rail vehicles would ruin the character of the city. Take a look at this car from Kansas City and tell me it doesn't have character. But if the tourism board insists, one could hypothetically build low-floor or articulated vehicles in an older style, because believe it or not, these have been around for a lot longer than you probably thought. There's a lot of options out there if New Orleans wants to serve both its guests and its own people with good rail transit, because fundamentally, serving everyone is what good transit should do. If you'd like to see a video featuring Blackpool's tram network and examining the unusual history that led to its modern state, I'm currently gearing up to produce a UK series in the near future, visiting namesake cities of places along the Northeast Corridor, and investigating the nation's most interesting transit. You can support this adventure by joining my Patreon or donating to my fundraising page for the new series. Thanks, and take care.